She looked at a beautiful butterfly sitting on a flower. It was her first time in such a beautiful garden. She never knew such a big garden existed. This was Ashtart Firenze. She was a princess of the Firenze Empire. Her one and only attendant, Loina Juarez, had brought her here. Would it be all right to come here again, or would they get in trouble? They'd gotten permission to enter the garden from the commander of the 5th Division of the Imperial Knights, Sir Ashton. This garden didn't belong to Ashtart even though she was a princess. It belonged to the Princess of Light. This garden was kept at peak condition and never withered because the first prince used magic to keep the lilies blooming all year round. Loina explained that magic kept the lilies fresh, and Ashtart found it so fascinating, her golden eyes shining with intrigue. She wished she could cast magic. Then she could stop the greenery from wilting outside her palace, and she'd make sure their palace would always be clean. Loina looked at her, saddened at the mature thoughts of such a young child. There was a reason Ashtart wished for such basic needs that she was already supposed to be receiving. Ashtart was an abandoned princess. In the Firenze Empire there was a prophecy that was the cause of Ashtart's misfortune. In the year 158 of the Empire, when the moon was at its darkest and when the red moon rose, 2 stars would be born. One of light that would bring prosperity to the Firenze Empire. And the other would be of darkness, said to swallow the light that would send the empire into ruin. And just as the high priest had prophesied, 2 princesses were born. The Princess of Light, born, had strikingly silver hair just like the prince's, was an illegitimate child. Despite that, she was revered by the people and pampered by her brothers and father, the emperor. While the Princess of Darkness, who was born of pure imperial blood, had hair as dark as night, something that was never seen in the history of Firenze. She was known as Calamity, that was to be avoided at all costs. The Empress died not long after she'd given birth to Ashtart, and this further proved Ashtart as a darkness that would bring the Firenze Empire to an end. She was cast aside to the Empress Palace, now abandoned. The Emperor and princes paid no heed to her, and everyone else took that as a point to ignore her as well. As if she didn't exist. But when Loina saw Ashtart for the first time, she couldn't believe Ashtart to be the darkness prophesied. Ashtart was, simply put, the brightest child she'd ever seen, despite her circumstances. Loina was furious at such a ridiculous prophecy. But Ashtart's stomach grumbled, interrupting her internal monologue. She needed to feed the princess, but she didn't want to leave. She rarely got the chance to leave the Empress's palace. Someone spoke up from behind, and it was Sir Ashton. Ashton would stay with Ashtart, and Loina could leave to get a snack for the princess. As Loina left, he grabbed Ashtart's hand and thought about how rough it was because she did palace work. A princess shouldn't have to do such things. They talked until they came across 2 people sitting in the garden underneath a pavilion. It was Crown Prince Miragen of the Firenze Empire and Imperial and beloved Princess Amaryllis. She curtsied to him as she greeted him with a bow, "Greetings, Your Highness." She recalled the first time she'd met him. She'd found him unconscious and wounded in the Empress courtyard and had nursed him until he'd awoken. She called him brother in question, and he'd coldly told her that she was not allowed to call him that. She was to address him as Crown Prince, as others do. The only person he allowed to call him brother was his younger sister, Amaryllis. But, was she not his sister too? The princess' words interrupted her thoughts. She invited Ashtart to join them for tea. She sat next to Amaryllis, and she told Ashtart with a slightly mocking tone, how fascinating it was to see such pitch-black hair in person. Ashtart shyly told her that it was her first time seeing Amaryllis' hair too. It reminded her of white lilies. With eyes as green as the peridot gems and an air of grace and elegance, this was the beloved Amaryllis of the Firenze Empire. She smiled and told Ashtart people told her not to get close to her. Ashtart looked down, disheartened at her words. She'd never seen a hairpin like that before, Amaryllis told her, and Ashtart smiled happily as she told her that Loina had gifted it to her. Amaryllis held out her hand. "Give it to me," she told Ashtart. Ashtart was taken aback. But this was hers. Amaryllis told her that if anyone had heard them, they'd think Amaryllis was forcing Ashtart to hand it over. She stood up. It was a cheap little thing anyway, so Ashtart could lend it to her, she said with a smirk. Sir Ashton was aware of how much that hairpin meant to Princess Ashtart. He recalled once when the princess had asked if there was lilies of the valley in the garden, because she'd told him how much she'd liked that flower. Loina had told her that lily of the valley symbolized becoming happy no matter the hardships when she'd given Ashtart that hairpin for her birthday. And since that day that flower had come to mean all the more to her. Ashtart looked at the beautiful princess and after a moment's hesitation, told her no, that hairpin was hers. Her eyes held the certainty she'd felt. Princess Amaryllis' eyes darkened in irritation. She'd dare to defy her? Cups and the teapot shattered as they fell to the floor. Princess Amaryllis grabbed Ashtart's hair intending to rip the hairpin of her head, but before she could, the crown prince grabbed her hand as he stopped her. "That's enough, Riley," he told her using the nickname he'd had for her. She looked at him in surprise, but then she yanked her hand away as she turned and cried. Seeing her cry worried the crown prince and he tried to appease her by offering her one just like it. She looked at him, tears running down her cheeks and called him mean. She wasn't forcing Ashtart to give it to her, she said, the picture of innocence. She glanced at Ashtart to find Sir Ashton helping her. Her brother had never opposed her before. She grew angry and flung accusations out just before she stormed off in a fury. The crown prince sighed and ordered Sir Ashton to follow her. As he left, a quietness settled over the table as Ashtart was left alone with the crown prince. She felt uncomfortable and decided to head back, but before she could leave the crown prince spoke up. Was that a new dress? It was a different one from the one he'd seen her in since their last meeting. His words surprised her, and he asked her if she liked it and if it was warm. She gave a cheerful yes to both questions. It was better than the old tattered one she wore, he thought to himself, but why did a princess not have enough dresses? Perhaps her attendants were not managing her finances well. She interrupted him as she spoke up. "Loina made it for me," she said. What did she just say? Was that what her attendant told her? He asked her angrily. She'd noticed his anger and hesitantly called out brother, but he scoffed at her. With glaring eyes, he told her, "I told you not to call me that." He warned her to be careful because he might have stopped Amaryllis today, but he wouldn't next time. His words shocked her, and she asked him, sadness flowing with her words, "Aren't I also your sister just as her? Even if they weren't the same, did she not deserve some love and affection too?" But his next words crushed any hopes she might have harbored. He told her if he had to choose between them, he'd choose Amaryllis in a heartbeat. She looked up at him as her golden eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but he only glared at her. He told her not to look at him like that because it was pointless. He didn't feel any guilt and he wouldn't abandon his sister for her. With that, he walked off leaving Ashtart with nothing but pain in her heart. She'd dreamed once about walking hand in hand with her brothers and father through the beautiful gardens, just as she's seen Amaryllis done. About having a loving family that cherished her as much as she did them, but she realized it was something not within her grasp even in this life. She got up, it was time to head back, but her foot tapped something on the ground. She picked it up, a book of magic? There weren't many people in the Empire who could use magic, only a talented few, and amongst them was the princes. Prince Miragen in particular was considered a prodigy by his skill. And in order to know magic, one would need to know many languages. But Ashtart was certain this was the first time she'd seen this language, but she was able to read it? She flipped the pages frantically as excitement grew within her. She wanted to read more. There were notes made by the prince, parts he deciphered and parts he didn't. If she helped him with this, if she was useful, could she too become considered as family? One spell in particular caught her eye, magic to find your destiny. As the spell left her lips, dysomsonia, she felt it flow through her. Her body felt light and bright light blinded her. When she opened her eyes, disorientated, she looked up to find herself in a room. How had she gotten here? She'd heard a strange sound, but was that because of the spell she'd read, she thought as she glanced at the book beside her. A loud clinking sound stopped her thoughts, startling her. What was in this room with her? She called out as she asked if someone was there, and she flinched as shoes came into view. A young boy with chains cuffed to his feet and hands stepped forward. His violet eyes shined dangerously. He said with a voice too low for a child, "If you're not a guest, you must be an intruder. If you leave now, I won't kill you." She repeated the spell over and over, but it was futile. The spell that had brought her here seemed it couldn't take her back, which confused her because it was the correct spell. The boy in the chains spoke from behind her as he questioned her about the type of spell it was. She'd found out his name, Abelian. It was a spell to find your destiny. He smiled amused. Was that a new way to court someone? He'd wanted to know, but Ashtart only blushed and denied it. He smiled as he told her, "That's too bad." She looked at him and thought about how scary she'd found him upon their first meeting. He'd caught her staring. Was there something on his face? She stuttered out a no, and he told her to tell him her name. "You said what brought you here was a spell to find your destiny," he told her as he approached her. He'd told her a story about her name. There was an ancient goddess who'd once been blessed with the name Ashtart. She was the goddess of war and love. His eyes as he gazed at her held curiosity. It had already been a few days since she'd stayed there, after countless attempts to get back home, but it all ended in failure. She'd also noticed his chains and thought him a prisoner, but he couldn't have been because he roamed freely, and he always fed her delicious foods. Which was the case as he scolded her for keeping food almost like a keepsake. He'd give her more tomorrow, so she was to eat plenty now. She gave him a beautiful smile at his promise. It had crossed his mind that she looked like a noble lady, but something about her hadn't seemed right. He glanced at her hands, too worn and calloused to belong to a noble lady. He recalled an incident a few days ago, about how she'd fretted about eating the food he'd given her and her boastful attitude at going an entire week on just water. The ridiculousness of that conversation still made him cringe. Her question pulled him from his thoughts. Had he been here alone all this time? He said no, and she questioned if he had family staying with him. He'd only answered vaguely. "I'm not sure," he said. A dark look overtook his face, but then he asked her about her family with an overly bright smile. The question took her by surprise, and she stalled, unsure how to answer. She'd never met her father, and when faced with a question like this, she'd think of Loina first before Miragen. Ryan, as Ashtart had nicknamed him, ran to him with excitement. She'd found a spell that could take her back, a teleportation spell. When he'd told her she could have just read it to him from where she sat, she surprised him as she said she'd wanted to show him for some unexplainable reason. As she read it, he watched her, mystified by this girl who was named after an ancient goddess and who had such striking raven hair, a color which he'd never seen before. A girl who read more than 500 spells since she'd arrived there, so proficient was her talent for magic. "Agriata," she said, and suddenly the text began to glow from the book as wind gathered and swirled around Ashtart. It surprised Ryan and startled him as the gust of wind toppled some books over on a nearby bookshelf, with Ashtart right in its path. He sprang forward and shielded her as the books fell on him. He immediately asked her if she was okay, but she was more concerned about him and apologized. He was reminded of his past as he'd once apologized just as she did. He stopped her. She shouldn't have to apologize for something that was out of her control, and she hadn't done anything wrong. She didn't think highly enough of herself. She gazed at him as a familiar feeling rose up inside of her. A warmth she'd only ever come to know from one person who cared enough to scold her when she hadn't valued herself. Loina. She looked at him curiously as she asked, "Ryan, are you worried about me?" He looked at her, seemingly confused. "Worried?" he questioned. She told him that she knew someone who'd scold her just as he did now. When she got a scolding, it seemed as if that person worried for her. She looked down shyly as she spoke the words that described her feelings. He apologized as he got up. He told her she reminded him of someone he once knew. He quickly changed the subject. Wasn't it time she stopped using magic since this was her 50th attempt? She looked down as she remembered her promise. She'd promised him to only cast magic 50 times at most for a day. She thought back to 3 days ago when she'd made that promise. She'd apologized to Ryan for failing yet again at casting that spell to get back home. She'd tried multiple times to no avail. She felt sadness as her emotions and self-confidence dropped because of the many times she'd failed. She should have never opened that book. She knew she'd be of no help to her brother like this. Ryan clapped his hands together and the sound startled her. "It's no good to get lost in your thoughts," he told her. He suggested she try some of the other spells in the book. It didn't have to be the spell that had brought her there. She wasn't confident she could do many of the other spells, but her eyes took on a look of determination as she said she'd try. She sat with the book open in front of her as Ryan stood in front of her. He'd told her there were 4 things they'd discovered. 1. It was that she couldn't use magic anymore. 2. There should have been a spell that would help her return to her home. 3. Mana is needed to use magic, mana in which she severely lacked. And 4. She had the ability to read every ancient language. The last point caught her attention, and she questioned him. He realized she'd read the languages unknowingly. There were 3 ancient languages: Roksek, Sem-Siberian, and Wayrak. Knowing just one would be enough to deem someone a genius, but knowing 2, that person could be considered a hero. Knowing all 3 would be worthy of praise and awe. Or it could be considered something that would bring about calamity. It surprised Ryan that Ashtart was so unaware of her own power and how dangerous it could be if wielded wrongly. She was but a naive child, oblivious to her fate. Because it seemed like that had been her first time using magic, he'd given her advice. "Keep it a secret from others," he told her. She looked at him anxious. She couldn't even tell Brother Miragen? When she questioned why, he told her it would be for her safety. Great power could cause many people to become wary or jealous of her. His words concerned her because it had never crossed her mind how the people around her would react to her ability to use magic. As Ryan put the book on a high shelf, he told her that he'd keep the book safe when she insisted that she still felt fine enough to do more spells. She pouted as he told her that she'd needed rest to recover her depleted mana. She stared at the book on the high shelf as she thought about the restriction he'd put on her. If she could only do 50 spells a day, there's no way she'd get home soon. She set the ladder against the bookshelf, and she began to climb it. She'd snuck back later to retrieve the book. The ladder was unsteady, and as she struggled to reach the book, she lost balance and slipped. She shouted out Loina's name as she fell, crashing onto the floor. Ryan had found her, and as he tended to her injuries, he scolded her. Thankfully, she hadn't gotten seriously injured, having only a couple of scratches and a bump on her head. She flinched back when the chains neared her face, and as it rattled loudly, he apologized for the sound, because he knew how scared she was of it, but she only told him that while in the beginning she'd been scared, now she wasn't. Because she now knew how kind Ryan truly was, he no longer frightened her. She'd only backed away because of how cold it was. Her words surprised him, but then he grinned at her and continued to set the plaster on her forehead. He stroked her hair affectionately, which startled her, but then she averted her eyes, happy at his patting. He questioned her about the name she called out as she fell, and she explained that Loina was someone she'd known for a long time. She never had a mother, but she had Loina. Within the Empress Palace, a palace where she'd been born, there weren't many people, and what few people were there ignored her existence. But that changed the day she turned 3, because that day, a young lady had entered the palace and she'd introduced herself as Loina, her new maid. Young Ashtart had smiled happily at the beautiful lady. But as time went on, the Empress Palace became more forgotten, and most knew that serving a princess like herself would bring them no honor. Yet Loina remained bright as she'd stayed by Ashtart's side. She'd once overheard a conversation between Loina and another maid. As Loina cleaned and tended to her duties, the other maid had questioned why she'd put in such effort when it wasn't really necessary. Loina had just smiled and continued to clean. The maid told her that everyone had already left for Princess Amaryllis's palace, and the only reason some of them remained there was because they'd missed the opportunity to leave. Loina hadn't paid much attention to her words and responded with a bored tone, and that seemed to set the maid off on a rant. She'd criticized Loina, who'd come from the countryside, And because she didn't know much about the capital or the prophecy about the Princess Ashtart, who was fated to become the star of darkness that would harm Firenze. Loina, who, up until this point, hadn't shown much of a reaction, threw the wet rag at the maid as the maid had uttered those words, an action which shocked the maid. Loina stepped forward as she questioned who'd spread such rumors about the princess, because not even the emperor had said a single word about the prophecy. She'd loomed over the maid as she'd threatened the maid to be careful with her words because saying the wrong thing could cause them to be beheaded for contempt against the royal family. She'd smiled coldly as she'd said the words. The maid, afraid, walked away hurriedly as she told Loina that she'd come to regret not listening to her. Ashtart, who'd watched the entire incident dejected at the maid's words, soon looked at Loina with wonder in her large golden eyes as Loina said loudly that there was nothing wrong with Ashtart. That was a moment Ashtart wouldn't forget for a long time because that was the first time someone had fought for her, if only for her honor. That was the beginning as Ashtart's feelings for Loina grew. First was joy and curiosity, which later grew into something bigger than gratefulness or love. Loina became someone incredibly special in Ashtart's heart. As Ashtart explained the importance of Loina in her life, her eyes glistened with tears, but the fondness reflecting in its golden depths for Loina couldn't be denied. Ryan watched her as she spoke, and as she told him that she didn't want to worry Loina, she needed to return soon, he closed his eyes and clenched his jaw in defeat. He knew how much she longed to go back to where she'd come from. He watched as she slept through the window separating his office and the little room. She'd finally gone to sleep after having caused chaos earlier. He thought about her words and the precious person who waited for her at her home. It began to weigh heavy on him, but he couldn't fathom why. As she'd spoken about that person, the tender expression on her face was something he hadn't seen from her before. It hadn't been long since they first met, but it piqued his curiosity when he thought about what kind of expression she'd make. When she thought of him, would she make the same kind of face she'd made earlier? He glanced up as the silhouette of a man came into view. "Didn't you come here because you had something to say?" he questioned. The captain came forward and he asked how long he would let the lady stay there. But when had the captain been interested in his guest? He tried to explain, but Ryan cut him off and told him to have the chef prepare sandwiches in the morning. He ordered from behind his desk. But only sandwiches Ashtart liked was to be made. He walked to the window as the captain obeyed. "Yes, young master," he'd said. But he was no longer the young master. He stood looking imposing despite his early age. He reminded the captain, his eyes reflected the threat in his voice, and the captain flinched in alarm. As the captain left, Ryan gazed at the worn-out silver hairpin in his hand as Ashtart mumbled in her sleep Loina's name. Back at the palace, the day Ashtart disappeared, Loina walked with a basket in hand as she thought about how hungry Princess Ashtart must be, since she'd been running around with Sir Ashton in the garden. But just then she'd spotted Sir Ashton searching the bushes for the princess. She smiled as she thought about how much fun the princess must be having with Sir Ashton. But she froze as she heard him call out Princess Amaryllis's name instead. But wasn't Sir Ashton supposed to be with Princess Ashtart? Princess Amaryllis came into view as she stubbornly marched away from Sir Ashton as he tried to calm down her fury. Why was he with Princess Amaryllis instead? Loina thought grimly. She dropped the basket of bread she'd been holding as she frantically called out to Sir Ashton, but stopped suddenly as Prince Miragen walked into the garden. He'd noticed her presence and she curtsied, eyes down in respect. The prince gazed at her, and his next words startled her. "Did you like the dress I gifted you, Loina Jores?" But she quickly responded with a generic answer. "It was an honor to receive it, Your Highness." His sharp gaze trained on her. He said. He was sure he'd sent dresses over for Princess Ashtart too, but why did she lie to the princess when she'd said she'd instead made them? But he'd never ordered her to explicitly say the dresses received were from him. That's why she'd lied to the princess. She needed to control her words as well as her beating heart that raged with nerves as her fear threatened to overwhelm her. After all, this was the second most honorable person in this empire, after the emperor, the crown prince, Miragen Firenze. A person with prestige and one of the handful of geniuses with the ability to use magic in this empire. He'd had no reason to speak to her and she knew she had to watch her words, or she might very well lose her life if she offended him. And yet, she couldn't contain the words that burst out of her, almost like a bursting dam. She clenched her hands into the folds of her skirt as she told him he was but a coward. His eyes widened in surprise. Did he hear her right? When she thought about Princess Ashtart and the treatment she'd received from the imperial family, an uncontrollable rage bubbled up inside her. A rage that's been fanned for a long time by piles of sorrow, and she couldn't stop herself from speaking up, even if that meant losing her life. What use was it to be kind to the princess only when he'd felt like it? The hope he created in her with his acts of kindness, only for it to be dashed away later by his harsh words, those were the actions of a coward. He scoffed, astounded by the audacity this wretched wench had to utter such words to him, this empire's crown prince. Sir Ashton, who'd been searching for the princess as she'd escaped him, was surprised to find Loina who stood with the crown prince. Prince Miragen warned her to watch her words unless she had a death wish. She glared at the prince, eyes full of hate as she thought about how hard she'd tried to keep the likes of them away from her pure soft-hearted princess. She'd tried her best to protect the princess to a point where she'd even prevented teaching the princess a certain nickname of the crown prince, but in the end, she'd failed. She recalled the last time he'd once again shattered Princess Ashtart's heart with his callous words. The princess had run behind the crown prince as she called out to him with that very nickname. "Brother, please wait," she'd called out, and he'd stopped at her words. He turned back and looked at her in disbelief. "What did you just call me?" he questioned. But she hadn't noticed his disgusted expression at the endearment because she'd whispered close to him as she told him that she'd wanted to make a request for a pretty dress for her attendant, and Loina had stood off to the side as she'd watched the entire exchange. Ashtart told him that she'd wanted to give Loina something because she was the person she'd really liked when Prince Miragen had asked her why she would gift her servant instead of herself. Ashtart had smiled sadly because she knew she'd not had the means to gift Loina something pretty. The crown prince sighed and accepted her request since he'd wanted to pay his due to her in return for saving his life. She'd let out a beaming smile as she'd thanked him once again, calling him brother, and Loina had smiled at the heartwarming exchange. A warmth she'd finally experienced after 10 long years of loneliness, but the prince's words soon dashed those thoughts away as he told Ashtart that he'd warn her once more not to call him that, unless she'd wanted to throw away her life. His red eyes lacked any of the warmth Loina thought she'd saw. As he'd walked away from the little princess, he'd said that only Riley was allowed to call him that, and she was to address him as everyone else, the crown prince. Loina at that moment had trembled with rage as she'd realized that there truly was no hope in redeeming themselves. She'd watched the brightness in Princess Ashtart disappear as she'd stood there, almost shrinking into herself as if trying to protect herself from the hurtful words flung at her. She bowed and asked the prince to please continue acting as he'd always been. Please ignore her for the next 10 years without expressing even an inkling of affection or hope. The crown prince's body shuddered with laughter. He'd given her a chance to speak, and she'd chosen to continue her ridiculous little speech? He looked up at her, seething with anger as he shouted, "You've gone too far, Loina Jores." But Loina stood firm in the face of his fury.